person, link it to this person, link it to this person. The amount of complexity that started to come into it. So I know when I was trying to, I think we were trying to go for a picnic with friends, and there was people in different tiers because they lived in different parts of the country. There was people that were on furlough, so they were going, oh, let's meet up at 10 o'clock in the morning. Other people that were working from home, other people that were working on site on hospitals, so were working really, really long hours. So the complexity of kind of saying, right, so you live here and you're in this tier, so you can't move here, you're in here in this tier, so you can move to us. And it was so complex, even just trying to get a 5-minute coffee date in. And even when we were trying to do it online, it was who's got Zoom, who's brought Zoom so they can have more than 45 minutes, who's gonna bring something to talk about, are we gonna do a quiz? There was so many different things that made everything really, really complex at that time. And also there's ambiguity that starts to make us feel a bit more out of control with things. And this is about the clarity of what's going on. How can we interpret what is happening? And how do we know what is happening? So as the diagram on the screen shows at the moment, if we've only got half a picture, we then have to kind of figure out what that rest of the half of the picture is telling us. So we're constantly then thinking, and we're using up energy going, okay, so we've got half an answer here about what we should be doing. So what does this mean for everything else? Again, when we think back to the early days of the pandemic, I remember the first couple of days, the guidance that had come out about PPE was very, very ambiguous because, again, the government didn't really know what was going on at that time. So it was kind of saying, right, so everybody has to have PPE, and that was the message that came across. But the half of the message that we didn't get was, where is the PPE coming from? What kind of PPE does it need to be? How do we get that across to all of our hospital sites? And so we were constantly working in this way where we were having half a picture and having to try and build on the rest of that picture. And the reason that it can feel tricky, the reason why we're taking the time to think about this, is because our brains, they like to have process, they like to have patterns. We receive about 13.5 million pieces of information per second, and our brains manage to filter that out to give us about 5 to 9 pieces of information per second. But that is still a huge amount of information that we have to try and keep up with and process. So our brains love to have certainty. Our brains love to have a bit of time to think about things. They love to have low complex issues because they can just go, right, this means this, let's go. And they love for things to be less ambiguous so that they can just work with things, and it can be a speedier process. We can follow patterns that we know, and our brain can then just process things a lot easier. When, oh, sorry, Helen, were you going to say something?
That's all right, carry on, I'll say it in a minute.
When we've got that uncertainty, and when we've got the complex information and we've got that half a picture, what our brains need to do is they need to work a lot harder because there's this gap of information. So they need to try and figure out what's coming. So we're using a lot of extra neural effort. So our brains are working 10 times harder when these things are coming up, which then mean that things like our memory starts being able to work as well because our brain is too busy trying to figure out what's going on. Our performance might dip again because, again, we're trying to figure out what's going on. We're trying to think about these new patterns that our brain can think about. And our engagement might go down because, again, we've used up a lot of our energy trying to think about what can I do in this situation? What can I predict? What can I figure out with half of the information that I've got? So our brain is working 10 times quicker. So I don't know if anybody else found it, that maybe at the beginning of the pandemic, we might have felt quite quite engaged and quite kind of, oh gosh, right, okay, we don't know what to do, so we need to kind of get into gear, we need to figure out what we're doing. And we might have had a little bit of burst of energy at the beginning of the pandemic because things were new, we were trying to figure it out. But after a while of living through these times, these VUCA times, we started to feel tired. We started to feel that tension because our brains had been on the go and working twice as hard as they were usually doing because they were trying to figure these things out. What we also might have noticed is that we might have felt more stress in this time. And again, the reason that we have this stress is because from when we were kind of caveman days, our brains had an alarm system built in to protect us. And the reason that it did this is because our brain would scan the environment for any danger. And then if we were to notice any danger, an alarm system would go off in our head and would flood cortisol throughout our system so that our bodies were prepared for any danger in our environment. What has happened over time is that we still have this alarm system, but the dangers in our environment are slightly different. They are more likely the things that we experience when we see things that change. So if we experience volatility, if we experience uncertainty, if we experience complexity and ambiguity, that alarm system will go off in our bodies so that we're able to deal with these things. So we might have noticed that we felt more stressed during the start of the pandemic and continuing throughout the pandemic, because again, our bodies and our brain is trying to figure out all of these things that we're doing at the moment. Helen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, as we were just looking at this, I was just reflecting and thinking it'll be different times in our lives, and there'll be times when everybody else might be fine and there's stuff that's going on, and we can experience this even if other people might not feel the same about a situation as well. And I was just reflecting on that, that sometimes you can feel yourself, that busyness or that volatility increasing, and it can kind of form that momentum. And actually, it becomes a vicious circle sometimes, doesn't it? Because what you were talking around our stress responses becoming high, don't know about for anybody else, but I notice then that my brain then starts to work kind of whiz, you know, when you end up with that feeling of, I can't cope with everything that's going on in my head right now. And that then kind of lends itself to this cycle going round, doesn't it? You then feel uncertain because you're not sure what's going on. Things become complex. Because you can end up with so many thoughts about different situations. It might just be that you've got a couple of tricky situations going on in your life, and one at a time you'd be like, I'd be okay with that. But when they all come together, it can create this as well. So I was just reflecting that actually we can be living in having a time where to anybody else they're like, no, it's quite normal, this is all okay, but we could still be experiencing this, and it's quite a personal interpretation of our connection with what's going on in our life, what's going on around us, and how we are processing that information and making sense of it. But sometimes it can feel like it's all a bit crashing in, I guess, a little bit kind of too much. And I think I was just connecting the feelings with, well, how would I know what the feelings that are connected with this? And does anybody else have to be experiencing that for it to be true for me or for each one of us?
Absolutely, Helen. I think that's a really, really good point in the fact that we're all different. So in terms of how we experience stress, we'll all experience stress differently. And as you said, it might be that there's for some people one thing that's uncertain or complex or ambiguity might be really, really tricky. For other people, it might be that the whole world is feeling that as well. So I suppose it's a really good starting point to think about where some of that trickiness might start to come in, and why that kind of happens for us as well, from a brain perspective, from a physiological perspective as well. So as ever with Team Boo, we like to give some really some top tips and some ways of and some tools to think about how can we try and deal with some of this complexity, some of the tricky things that we see when things are changing a lot of the time, when there's a lot of uncertainty, when there's a lot of complexity, when we don't have that when we don't have that ambiguity. So what can we do to try and help ourselves when we're going through these situations? And one of the things we wanted to start thinking about is our perspective on change. So there's a couple of quotes that we've put on the screen here at the moment. There are some really lovely ones that I really like. And what we're trying to get the message across here is that whilst we may not be able to control everything, and whilst we may not be able to handle some of the things when change is going on. Sorry, there's quite a lot of feedback at the moment. I'm just wondering if everyone's so when we're thinking about change, when we're thinking about what we can do about change, we may not be able to control what is going on, but we can control the way that we respond to that thing that's happening. And there's some really lovely quotes here. So Maya Angelou says, if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude. And then there's a couple here from Wayne Dwyer. You can't always control what goes on outside, but you can always control what goes on inside. And when you change the way that you look at things, the things you look at change. And so the reason that we've put these on here is to start thinking about what can we do if change is happening and we're finding it really tricky. There are some certain ways that we can start to create certainty. So one of those is all around acknowledging what is happening. The first step to thinking about how can we control how we're feeling about changes is to just write it down. So to really help us process what is going on and to help us acknowledge what is going on for us, we can write down, maybe even through journaling, maybe it's even through bullet points, but finding a way that helps us to process what is happening and maybe what we're thinking and feeling about it is the first step in order to help us to understand what we can do to feel and thrive through that change. If you're not a person who likes to write things down, maybe talking it through with a friend. We all have different learning preferences. We all have different styles and ways of processing. So think about the ways of processing that you enjoy best. Are you the type of person who likes to write things down, or do you prefer to talk things out? But doing those things can really help us to process what we're thinking about it. Another thing we can start to do is get involved with the change. So what we mean by this is by understanding what you can do and understanding what you can be part of to feel part of that change. I'll give you a really personal example here at the moment. I'm going through some changes within my housing situation. And there's a lot of ambiguity around it. There's a lot of complex factors. There's a lot of different people, different relationships involved. There's a lot of uncertainty because we don't know what's going to happen. We're waiting to hear things, and things keep changing all the time because of government legislation. So one of the things that I've done to try and create some of that certainty for myself is to get involved in that. And the way that I've done that is by joining groups of people talking about what's going on, is by speaking to some of my neighbours about their understanding and their processing thoughts around things. I've joined task groups to be able to be part of the change and to be able to give my opinion and talk about what's going on. I've joined up with MPs to be able to talk about with MPs what's happening and what kind of influence they can have. That's just a personal example of one of the ways that I've tried to get involved in a change, but whatever change it might be that you're going through, that might be another way of thinking about that. So if it's a change at work, what can you do in the workplace to get involved with that change? What kind of meetings can you go to? Who can you be involved with? If it's something in your personal life, thinking about what kind of things you can do to be involved in that change.
I'm just looking at the questions, and there's a question around, would we advocate talking through on an individual or team basis applying radical conduct? And I think that's a really interesting question. And I don't think there's a blanket answer to that. I don't think there's a yes or a no. It's about, I guess it depends on your relationship with that person. It depends where that person is in terms of how they're feeling around the uncertainty and where they are on that VUCA model as well, I guess. Somebody might just be in a heap, and that might not be the time at which we need to be really direct and honest about what we're noticing about that situation. They might purely need the compassion initially to go, right, okay, how are you? What's going on here? Right, I'm here for you. It might come later that they need that honest reflection. There are some people that I would absolutely welcome that direct honesty from, and there's other people that no matter how they said it, I wouldn't take it as a compassionate or a helpful way, particularly if I was feeling quite vulnerable. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I guess my answer to this is we need to tread carefully around that one. Think about what's the relationship with the person, where are they at, are they ready to hear that? Because it could sometimes be seen that we're stepping in to fix somebody's problems, as opposed to just acknowledge and validate somebody's feelings. There's a whole other webinar in that, actually, isn't there?
Yeah,
But
there is.
initially, what people often need is they need their feelings validated before they are ready for that real direct and honest feedback or observation about a situation. Having said that, it is sometimes a helpful thing, because when previously we were talking about perspectives, that, and I'm guessing that's when the question appeared, I didn't see it pop up, that actually sometimes that is what can help somebody to change their perspective. But we've got to be really careful we don't step into the toxic positivity area of just going, well, good vibes only. It's like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, but things are a bit rubbish right now. So it's getting a balance, and I guess using our emotional intelligence in, if we're seeing somebody else going through this, how do we navigate that sensitively, so that we don't alienate people? Because I guess the worst thing we can do here is make somebody feel really alienated and pushed away. But I'd be, interested to see anybody else's thoughts around that as well.
Thank
Patty,
you.
was there anything that you thought of when you saw that?
I think you've talked through everything there, Helen. I think that's a really good response, and thank you for that question, and thank you for bringing that up, Helen.
Okay. There's another question just popped up. If it's a whistleblowing conversation, how would you guide someone to help? I'm wondering where that's coming from. Part of me wonders whether that's a different situation. Whistleblowing is often, somebody's in the same way as we'd break confidentiality if we thought somebody was at risk for themselves or to somebody else. We step into a different space when we're in that situation. I think we can have uncertainty and challenging times without it being a whistleblowing situation. I think as soon as we put something else on, like whistleblowing or safeguarding or anything like that, actually normal rules change slightly because we need to support people in a slightly different way. And obviously there'd then be that would when you'd be looking at policies within organisations as well to be able to support that.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you're not interpreting that as a sidestep into the conversation. I just think we're at risk of going down a rabbit warren with that one. And I think it's a slightly different thing than actually when we're living through uncertainty and how we move ourselves essentially from surviving to thriving.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions, and thank you for bringing those up as well, Helen. So if we're thinking about tools to help us in terms of surviving and thriving through change, one of the really lovely tools that we often use when we are thinking about this with coaching clients or with friends or with ourselves is to use a coaching wheel. Now, the idea of the coaching wheel is to identify the areas that might be feeling a little bit tricky due to the changes that are happening. So it might be, let's say we've got a change going on in the workplace. One of the areas that might be a thing that is kind of coming up for us is making us feel a little bit stressed. One of the areas might be some of the workplace changes. It might be our work-life balance. Maybe our motivation isn't feeling as great whilst we're going through this change. Maybe it's not our confidence. Maybe we're thinking about our well-being or even our identity as things are changing. But with the coaching wheel, what we would recommend is starting with a blank wheel and thinking about the areas that might impact or might influence the way we feel when we are going through a change. Now, the idea of the coaching wheel is you pop into each of these segments. It doesn't have to be 6, it can be 8, it can be 4. It's however many things there are that are going on for you at the time. We have done 6 because it's easier to draw on a circle. There is no right or wrong in terms of how many segments you use. So the idea here is to identify the things that might be feeling tricky as you're going through the change. Then what we would like you to imagine you to do is in the center of the circle, if you imagine that's a 0, and the outside of the circle, if you imagine that's a 10. And then what you do is you start by thinking about where do I feel about those different things right now. So you would go through and you would mark across, let's say for workplace changes, because I don't know what's happening or I'm a little bit nervous about what's going on, maybe I feel about a 2 out of 10. And you would go through and you would mark yourself for each of those different areas out of 10. And then what we'd recommend that you do is to go through again with maybe a different color pen so that you can see the difference. And thinking in a realistic world, you know, we would love to be 10 out of 10 on everything in the world, but that's not always realistic. So we'd like you to think, you know, if I was thinking in really realistic terms, where would I like to be? What would help me to feel better about this change? What would help me to feel better about this uncertainty? And then go through and mark yourself again from 0 to 10 on what that might be. So I might say, if we're thinking about those workplace changes, if I'd have scored myself at a 2 at the moment, maybe I'd say, actually, you know what? I would feel a lot better if I was just at a 5. And then through that, what we would recommend doing is thinking about what tiny little things can you do to make some movements towards where it is you would like to be. So for example, again, if I was at a 2 on workplace changes and I wanted to be at a 5, I might think about what would get me to a 3 right now? What would help me to feel that slightly little bit better? And maybe that would be having a conversation with the team about what was going on, talking to somebody about the changes, talking to somebody about what is happening in the organization so that I understood it maybe a little bit more. Once we've got that wheel, once we've identified all of those different areas where we would like to make some changes, what we would recommend doing then is thinking about what is within our control. So sometimes we can't change what's happening. So sometimes there will be things happening that are beyond our control. But as we were saying before on those perspectives around change, there will always be things that we can do to help us in terms of what can we control. So we might not be able to control the fact that there are workplace changes, but we might be able to control the fact that we can be involved in those workplace changes, or we could be part of task groups around those workplace changes, or we might be able to talk to people about what is going on. We might be able to shape what is going on. So we would then recommend you to think about what are the things that you can control about those particular areas, and what are the things that maybe aren't outside of that are outside of your control. Those things that are outside of our control, we would recommend trying to think about how can we let those things go. I know that sounds so much easier to say than it is to do, but if those aren't things that we can control, those are the things that we might have to put aside and think about, right, what can I focus on? Where can I put my energy into the things that I can control? Oh, Helen, I think you're on mute.
I was, sorry, it's because I was typing away. I really like this tool, and it's something I don't use this one as a drawn out one or written down one. The circle, that there was a few questions around the coaching wheel. I do, but this one I tend to use as a reflective. I walk an awful lot in order to process my thoughts and just think things through. And it's something. It's probably one of the things I first go to when I notice, as we shared in the first slide, that kind of what's going on in uncertainty in terms of the VUCA, the 4 different areas. When I notice that that's happening for me, this is one of the first tools that I will use, but I'll think it through in my head and go, right, okay, what's well without your control? What have you got nothing over? What can you influence and what is within my control? And I will shape my thoughts accordingly, and I will use it, particularly as I'm walking, which is why I don't write it down. It's really tricky trying to use a notepad whilst you're walking, particularly in winter when it's dark. But yeah, it's one of the ones that I go to and thinking, right, okay, I'm overthinking, my mind's too busy, there's too many things in terms of in terms of what's going on, too much uncertainty, and thinking around how do I make it less complex? Because sometimes the complexity, when we go back to our original model, is around the fact that we're taking on things that actually we can't even influence them. They're outside of our influence, but we're taking them on as our own. Or kind of that uncertainty becomes really massive, and it's like, that's because there's things that are out of my control. So for me, this is one of my, I said I love the wheel, which I do as a coach. As an individual, actually, this is one of the ways that I capture my thoughts when things are feeling wonky. Less technical word, but wonky. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that I'm kind of similar when I'm processing things. I like to write things down. I like to have everything on a piece of paper. So I'm slightly different in that I like to see it. And so when I can see those things that I'm like, oh, actually, I can't control those things, it helps me to then kind of say, right, I can kind of like take those off the piece of paper. So then I'm left with just one piece of paper that is just the things that I can control and that I can take ownership of. And that helps me to feel a little bit more in control when I'm going through something that's really tricky or a lot of change as well.
There's a question related to this as well. Is there a problem that some people tend to worry too much about things they cannot influence, which prevents them from pulling together their own action plan? I think we can all fall into that
Yep.
space. Some people are more prone to it than others, and it's something that actually, as we develop our emotional intelligence, as we develop our coping mechanisms, for somebody that is a worrier or is a big kind of, people use the word overthinker, and I don't necessarily think that's fair, but it's about being a thinker and thinking about everything. It's about how do we learn that? So this tool can help to do exactly that, in terms of, so it might be that actually you use the tools the other way around, that you do this first of all, and then say, right, so from what's within my control, how do I put that into a coaching wheel? Everybody's different. And actually, Patty and I had quite a conversation as we were putting this together in terms of, well, what order would we do it with? And I think the answer is, as it often is when we're looking at things with the coaching style, is that it depends on the individual. So you're absolutely right. Some people might need to do this first to help them let go of that stuff. And then there'll be other techniques, maybe mindfulness gets talked about quite a lot in terms of being able to let things go. Mindfulness looks different for different people. I mentioned that I like walking, and that for me is my form of mindfulness and of processing, because it removes me from sitting at my desk or being in the house or whatever. Somebody said they're a professional worrier. Somebody once, yeah, I can have a tendency to go into that. Somebody once said to me that two emotions that don't really serve us any purpose in moving forward or processing, the one is worrying and the other is guilt. So both of those emotions will leave us sat in that place and stopping us from moving forward. If we're angry, it's a space that we move through. If we're sad, it's processing something and we will move through it. But often, worrying and guilt, we are left sitting in it. So I guess it's a challenge for those worriers and guilt feelers amongst us to find ways of saying, well, how am I going to force myself to move on from that? Find what it is that works for you. Because it really made sense to me when somebody pointed out that they're two emotions. There might be others, but I've never really spotted what they are, if there are any others. But they're two that don't serve us a purpose really in helping us to move through and find a way forward. But this tool for me helps me to capture some of that and go, right, Helen, you really are worrying about something that you can worry all you like, but you can't do anything about it. What bit can you do? And it comes back to some of that perspective stuff as well, doesn't it? Of saying, right, let's look at this from a different angle. Okay, if you really, really don't have any influence, what can you control? What do you have the choice of? So it's looking at it from a different angle, which on some days is easier than others.
Yes,
None of this is
definitely.
like really easy to do, but it's helping you to think about that. But we want to share with you a really practical thing around self-compassion, which I think fits in with this, particularly when we're thinking about guilt or around worry, but also in terms of how do we actually care for ourselves and really notice that. Sorry, gone on too far. So self-compassion. When we're thinking around this, essentially what it is, it's about becoming an inner ally instead of an enemy, and treating yourself as you would a good friend. Sometimes when we find ourselves in these challenging situations and we're just trying to survive, what happens is our inner critic becomes much louder. And when that little voice in our head starts being me, you know, you should do something about that. I'm worrying about this. What if I said this? What if I said that? What if somebody thinks this about me? And so for those of us that fall into the worrying camp or the big kind of lots of thoughts camp, this can be some of the stuff that's going on. We will all have an inner critic at some point in our lives. So even if it doesn't happen to you in tricky times, this is really relevant for you in the times when your inner critic is loud or your imposter syndrome. And so when we are thinking about self-compassion, there's lots of research being done on this. And what it shows us is that both our mental and our physical health will benefit from us practicing self-compassion. Now that's pretty amazing, isn't it? And research has shown when people practice self-compassion, they see a reduction in things like depression or anxiety or their stress levels. Patty was talking about them earlier in terms of what happens when our stress responses kick in. Self-compassion helps to lower that, and also shame. For those of you that have heard of Brené Brown, she talks quite a lot around shame and the impact, and that again links in with the feelings of guilt and worry that are not helpful for us, not helpful emotions. But self-compassion can reduce that. What it also does is it increases levels of happiness, levels of life satisfaction, just feeling more content, I guess, increases our self-confidence and increases our physical health as well. So when we look at that, why would we not want to practice self-compassion? But again, it's not always easy. We don't always get it right first time. And it's something that we need to think of. This work around self-compassion is based on some work by Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer, and they wrote the Mindful Self-Compassion workbook and have done an awful lot of research for which I'm very grateful. So I just want to do a little exercise with you. You'll need pen and paper, hopefully you've got that nearby, and what I want us to do is think about how do we treat a friend. So I want you to grab your pen and paper, and then I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to ask you. Trying to get the slides to it's not working. Right, okie doke. Brilliant. Okay, so on your piece of paper, I want you to think about when a friend has come to you and they're maybe not feeling their best. they're needing a little bit of help, something's happened, they're blaming themselves, they're being really down on themselves. And I want you just to write down, what are some of the things that you would say to that friend? Maybe what are some of the words that you would use? What would you say? Think about maybe your tone of voice. How would you say it? Is there anything that you do? And just think about how you might feel towards that friend. Might be a work colleague, whoever it was that had come to you. How might you feel? And what would you be wanting to create in that moment? Okay, so you should now have a list of things that you would say or do, or how you'd say and do them, and what that would feel like. I want you to either draw a line under that, or write on the, not on the back of that piece of paper, it needs to be in a separate space, or grab a different piece of paper. We're going to think about what we would do for ourselves. So you've had a tricky situation, you're feeling a bit down about it, you're feeling a bit worried about it, you think, oh, I've done this wrong, I've done that wrong. What would you say to yourself? It hasn't gone as you planned. It didn't quite work out. Hasn't gone very well. What would you say to yourself? Maybe what words would you use about yourself? What tone might you have with yourself? What might you do? And what would your general feelings be? Okay, so you should now have two lists, one about if a friend comes to you and one about if it happens to you. I'm happy for you to share in the chat, but Patty, I'm going to ask you in a moment. What do you notice when you look at those two lists? What do you notice? Is there any difference between them? Are the lists the same? Oh, somebody's put that they're complete opposites. Has anybody else found that in terms of when you look at your list, you're harder on yourself, so hard on myself? Oh, Patty, I might not even need to ask you. The lists are very different. I'm pretty mean to myself compared with others. Right, yeah. Oh, it's giving me goosebumps. It always does when we do this. It really goosebumps in a, oh, I just want to give you all a hug. You're raging with yourself. Somebody's put completely different. Some similarities on both. That's good. That's good. Maybe you've already done a bit around this, but you're going against the flow there. In that most people are saying, gosh, they're totally different lists. And what we often find, yeah, the friend list is amazing, but for myself, it is harsh. From what I'm seeing here from the chat, that seems to be the general theme that people are finding. And Patty, what's your list tend to be, particularly the first time you did this?
Oh, the first time I did this, I almost cried because I looked at what I was saying to my friend and I was like, yep, that's really nice. And I looked at what I said to myself and I was awful. I was absolutely awful to myself, and it made me feel actually really sad the first time I did it. They were complete opposites. I was to my friend, I was very supportive, I was very kind, I was using really lovely words. Um I was saying that, I'd give them a hug, I'd be really like soft in my tone. But to myself, I was like, "You're awful. I can't believe you've done that." I was really aggressive. I was really angry. Don't deserve a hug, and any of those really nice things. So it was really, really different. It was actually a really eye-opening exercise the first time I did it.
Thank you for sharing that, Patty. That was definitely my experience the very first time that I did this as well. What I would like you all to do, unless your list to yourself is the same as to your friend and your list to yourself is really compassionate and kind and loving, if it isn't, which a lot of you are not, the ones that you're like, gosh, I'm really horrible to myself, I've been really harsh there, what I want you to do is, if it's on the bottom half of the piece of paper, I want you to rip it off. If it's on another piece of paper, I want you to get the list that is what you've written of how you respond to yourself, and I want you to either screw it up really tight into a ball or rip it into loads of little pieces, whatever it is that's going to work for you. I want us to destroy it or scribble all over it, whatever it might be. Go, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And we are going to get rid of that. Stick it through the shredder, do anything. We're going to get rid of that list because we don't want to keep hold of that list. We don't want to keep hold of that way of being with ourselves. Stick it in the bin, do whatever it is. If you've got a log fire, stick it on that later. Whatever it might be, stick it in a ball, throw it in a ball for now, whatever it might be. We're going to get rid of that because I'm going to tell you what's going on there and why we need to challenge ourselves in doing this. And let me show you how we can be more self-compassionate and what that means. My slides change, they're not playing today. Here we go. Right, there's 3 core elements of self-compassion. Let me tell you what they are, and you will notice that they're very different from those harsh lists that we write for ourselves. The first one is around self-kindness, being kind to ourselves. So starting to have kind words. One is around being connected and having that common humanity with other people, and also treating ourselves as a human as we would with anybody else, any friend, anybody else, that we wouldn't go, oh my goodness, you're a total failure, aren't you? But somehow we think it's okay to say that to ourselves. No, let's be connected. Let's think about ourselves as a human and have that connection with other people. And the third element of this is around presence. It's around mindfulness. And as I mentioned before, that will mean different things to different people. Let me tell you why these 3 things, and the reason this is important is there's 3 different elements. You might be really good at one of these, but go, oh, I've never done that, or I never bring all 3 together. And this is the trick, I guess, behind self-compassion. So, don't worry too much, but our brain thinks in different ways. The very first response we will have is from our reptilian brain, which is instinctual, which is where our fight and flight kicks in. And any situation we face, we will make an assessment as to whether it's safe or not, and our stress responses will kick in accordingly. That is always going to be our first response to any situation. After that, our limbic brain kicks in, which is our emotional or our feeling brain. So we will then feel the emotions connected to that stress response. And finally, our neocortex kicks in, and this is our rational or our thinking brain, which then thinks things through really quickly and says things like, oh, I've got no influence under that. Maybe I can't control it. Let's look at this differently. But it kicks in last, very helpfully. I'm sorry. We can't change the way that that happens. But what is going on there is that our stress response when we look at fight, our stress response when we turn in on ourselves, when we're being really critical, is that we will have self-criticism. So those horrible things that we say about ourselves, we will criticize ourselves, and it's our stress response turned in. If we're being self-compassionate, actually what we need to turn that around and into is self-kindness. That's why I made you throw that list away, because what we want to practice is being kind to ourselves. So what we need to do is respond to ourselves in the way that we would do to a friend. Our stress response of flight will lead us to isolate ourselves, either physically or mentally, from other people. It's like, I'm not good enough to be around them. I can't contribute to this conversation. I'm going to go and disappear somewhere. We need to turn that around to common humanity. So this is about, first of all, saying, I'm human, I make mistakes, and that's okay. But also then connecting with somebody, whether that's just sending a message, and just remembering that we are connected to other humans. And our freeze stress response will turned inward is around rumination. It's staying in that moment. So things then get bigger. And I did this and I did that. Oh my goodness. And I can't believe that happened. Oh my, I'd forgotten about that bit. That's even worse. We start ruminating on it and it's not serving any purpose. What we need to do is move into mindfulness. As I've said, for me, that's walking. My friends joke and they're like, gosh, I bet you walked 10k that night, didn't you, Helen? Because they know I walk further in order to get to a point of getting out the other side of this stress. So whatever mindfulness means to you, it's just about bringing yourself back to the present moment, because you're no longer in the moment that happened. So self-compassion helps us to move on and move away from the stress response being turned inward, and will help us to find a better place. There's a whole webinar in this in itself, but we just wanted to introduce you to this because it's really about how do we move on and what's something really practical that we can do. When we practice self-compassion, what we're doing is we're deactivating those stress response systems, and what we're starting to activate is a care system instead, the same compassion that we would show to other people. So we've covered a lot today, and I just want to give you a little reminder of everything that we have talked about. Understand your responses to tricky times and to change. What does your VUCA look like? What are your responses to that, and how can you start to spot it earlier? Think about how you can reflect and reframe your perspective, not in a toxic positivity kind of a way, but just, is there another way of looking at this? When we're so angry about the words that somebody has said, often I stop and think, I don't think they meant that personally. They've forgotten that I'm on the receiving end of this. They've forgotten to actually word this nicely. Maybe they're not okay and they've just, you know, come out with their anger or whatever. So that's a way of reflecting and reframe, but just thinking about things differently. Focus on the things that you can control. So think about, how do we go, right, I'm going to move all of that away because I can't control this. I can control this little bit here. Be compassionate to yourself, because those other things are going to be easier if we are being compassionate, practicing self-compassion. It takes time. I've been practicing self-compassion now for about 2.5 years since I first discovered that model. Still don't always get it right, but it's getting quicker. And I don't dwell for as long. Connect with other people. Let's share our thoughts and so on. So that we can then start to connect with other people and understand other people are human as well. And maybe find a mindfulness practice that works for you, whatever it is that helps to bring you back into the moment. Okay, I just encourage you to think about something that's going to help you prioritize your well-being today, because the more that we prioritize our well-being, the easier all of this becomes. So it's a nice, still early in the day, still lots of time to get those things in order to prioritize something. Somebody's put in the chat, needing to retrain myself not to blame me for everything that happens in the world. We can do that sometimes, can't we? So yeah. That brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that's been useful for you and given you some things to reflect on. Be kind to yourselves, and let's all support each other and recognise we'll have tricky times at different moments, but we can all be there for ourselves and for each other. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you everybody, and thank you to Patty and Helen for this morning's session. Really great session, and some very helpful reminders around self-compassion, which I think most of us can take away. I'm sorry that some of you have had technical issues. I did press record. We did miss the first 5 minutes, but I did press record, so hopefully you were experiencing those, if you can hear me or see me. You will be able to pick that back up. It'll be stored on the members hub. A survey will be sent out afterwards, and I'd really appreciate it if you could spend just 2 or 3 minutes completing that to help us frame the next few events that we do for members. We want to know what you want to hear from us, what topics are important. So have a great day. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming together this morning. Great way to start the day. Any problems, just reach out to us at HPMA, and we'll see you again very soon. Have a great day and be kind to yourself. Thank you,
everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.